Yes.
Yeah, okay, we're on air then. Yeah, thank you, yeah. And welcome to this 12th session of the Applied Urban Modeling Conference in 2020. And I'm Ying. On behalf of the Scientific Committee of the AUM 2020 and the co-conveners, I would like to welcome all of you to this session. And this is likely to be a unique session in this whole series, where we have invited a whole group led by Professor Mike Batty and Professor Mark Birkin to look at spatial modeling in Royal Society's Rapid Assistance in Modeling the Pandemic program, or the RAMP program, to look at an extraordinary effort of 4 universities collaborating together to look at the spatial effects and the spatial implications of the short-term effects of the pandemic. And it covers a really large number of areas. And we first will have Professor Mike Batty from University College London to give us an overview of the RAMP, the RAMP program. And then we have a recorded presentation by Professor Mark Birkin, a professor of spatial modeling and policy at the University of Leeds, and also the program director for Urban Analytics program in the Alan Turing Institute, to give us an overview of the urban analytics tasks of the RAMP program. Then we go through a series of tasks with Dr. Nick Lomax from University of Leeds and Dr. Karyn Morrissey from University of Exeter to talk about microsimulation of the residential population. This is a good place to start. And then we'll have Professor Adam Dennett and Dr. Richard Milton from University College London to look at modeling of different spaces, particularly for retail, education, and the crucial activities that's been operating during the pandemic. Then the Cambridge team with Dr. Jamil, Shanshan and myself to look at the transport effects, particularly commuting to work, and the areas of the effects, the complexities of the labor market and its implications, spatial implications, and so on. And finally, Professor Gavin Shaddick and Dr. Fiona Spooner of the University of Exeter will talk to us about the simulating the COVID-19 in the community and its spreads, and more of looking at the effects of the virus in the context of the spatial models that were presented here. And then at some point, Professor Mark Birkin will also join us. And at this point, our session chair, who is Steve Denman from the Cambridge group, will then coordinate the inputs, particularly an important input from our discussant, Dr. David Simmonds, who has been working on the pandemic modeling, actually for Scottish government and other clients who actually have been doing a rapid response as well. So actually we're very lucky to have the whole group of people like that, actually to have a continued conversation in the whole 2 hours period. And because these models that are in the RAMP program are connected, the format that we have planned was that each speaker will speak, and then there will be time for clarification questions, and then move to the next one, so that to give people a broad view of all of the modeling work that's been actually done and how they're connected, until the end of the RAM presentation, and we'll have Dr. David Simmonds to give us his thoughts, and then we'll go into the question and answer session. And this is really an exciting session actually to look forward to. And I will at this moment hand over to Professor Mike Batty to actually give us the first introduction about the whole efforts of the RAM program. Mike.
Okay, thanks very much, Ying. Let me tell you a little bit, spend about 5 to 10 minutes just introducing this and tell you a little bit about RAMP, which as you know, is called Rapid Assistance in Modelling the Pandemic. The RAMP working group, and it is very much a working group, it's not really a group that is doing research as such. I mean, we'll be talking this afternoon about the urban analytics stream within RAMP, which has been promoted by RAMP. So RAMP really is a facilitating group to look at pandemic modelling, or to look at the pandemic and models of the pandemic, which are not strictly speaking epidemiological. There are many different sorts of aspects of the pandemic, and RAMP was set up by Mike Cates, who's Professor of Mathematics, Lucasian Professor at Cambridge in March 2020, just as it became clear that there was going to be a pandemic in this sense, and just prior to the fact that we became all locked down for the first time. So RAMP set up several things. It's a working group of about 10 to 12 people from different areas, which will become clear in a moment as I elaborate it. And the focus is really on exploring how models and data, other than classic epidemiological models based on SCIR, how they can actually support analysis and interventions. And the models in our domain, which we're talking about this afternoon, covered 2 of the themes which have been developed in RAMP. One, urban analytics, and the other, human dynamics and small spaces. Now, Mark Birkin and myself are both members of the steering committee. Mark is responsible for urban analytics, and that's what we'll mainly talk about this afternoon, the various contributions. And I'm responsible really for motivating the work in human dynamics and small spaces. And I'll say a little bit about that, but not very much, just to give you an idea. So in some senses, all our focus is really on incorporating questions of location, mobility and space-time geographies really into this notion of the pandemic. And it's become very clear, I think, in the last 6 months that the geographical question is particularly significant. It's ever more significant. It probably always was significant, but if you actually look at the statistics which were produced by the various government agencies back at the beginning of the pandemic, they were really non-geographical at all. Only in the last couple of months has become very clear that there are some very substantial variations in infection and obviously in terms of potential intervention, lockdown and so on, with respect to the geographical distribution. So basically RAMP began, and it launched a call back in March 2020, and it asked for expressions of interest in this question of modelling the pandemic other than spatial epidemiological models, which were very well covered already, of course. And there was something like 1,800 expressions of interest from this call, an enormous number of expressions of interest ranging from various companies through to academic groups, big groups, small groups, individuals, and so on. And the idea was that we in the committee would motivate projects within these expressions of interest. Now, of course, of 1,800, only about 50 or so have been motivated in some sense in that context by the RAMP committee, and I'll talk about those in the urban analytics and the small spaces area in a moment. So that was one aspect of RAMP. The other aspect, several aspects, another aspect was the setting up of discussion forums, the rapid review of papers. And these papers were really designed to be input to 2 government committees. One, the SPI-M committee, which is Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling. Now, SPI-M have actually been in existence for many years, basically, as indeed have SAGE, which is the Strategic Advisory Group on Emergencies, basically. These are the two, when, for example, people in this country talk about the science, basically, they mean work that's come out of SPI-M and also SAGE in that sense. So RAMP was designed to feed information of various sorts to these two committees, and on the steering committee there are various people from SAGE and RAMP on the RAMP committee, that is. Also, the Newton workshops, the Newton Institute in Cambridge have a series of workshops which have run alongside this in epidemiology and in non-epidemiological pandemic related issues. Data has been fairly central to it. A couple of weeks ago, Kay Axhausen talked a lot about mobility data, and increasingly this mobility data has become very significant. This is one of the things that is very difficult to get in the UK. A lot of agencies such as the ONS and so on have tried very hard to get the mobile phone companies to provide data and to donate data to the public cause in a sense, but we're still very bereft really of detailed data in that sense, other than the standard data that's available from Apple and Google mobility reports and so on. So the data side is important in this particular context. There's another Royal Society committee like RAMP called DELVE, which is Data Evaluation and Learning for Viral Environments. And both RAMP and DELVE are instrumental in providing information from the academies to the national data strategy, which is also going on in parallel. Nothing really to do with the pandemic per se, but the national strategy is being worked upon in this sense. And you can get information about RAMP from the Royal Society website. Okay, now the three related tasks. Let me focus on urban analytics. Three related tasks, I think, are several tasks in the RAMP committee, and these are really urban analytics, which is what Mark Birkin is responsible for, and which we've been mainly talking about this afternoon. Human dynamics in small spaces. Now, I'm going to say something very briefly about that in a moment, because that's the task that is quite relevant to the geography, but it's very fine scale. And there's a third task. This is of several other tasks, basically. A third task on environmental and aerosol transmissions. And if we look at these tasks, these areas of modelling, three, which is urban analytics, which we mainly be talking about, is at the kind of location and metro and regional scales and so on. The small spaces work, task 6, which is loosely called human dynamics in small spaces, is at the level of really movement in buildings and small areas, supermarkets and so on. So it's really at the tens of meters type scale. And then the environmental and aerosol transmission that is run by Paul Linden from Cambridge and Chris Payne from Imperial. That's really to do with how aerosol transmissions take place within buildings, basically, and they're connected up in this particular sequence, loosely connected, I should say. So fairly typically, we'll be concentrating on the geographical scale this afternoon, in the sense of cities. At the scale related to human dynamics and small spaces, that's a model of a small supermarket. I'll say something a little bit more about that in a moment. And then downstream into buildings, basically, then the notion of aerosol transmission. You can see somebody sneezing, basically, in that sense. So both aerosol transmission from individuals, from humans, basically, and also how the virus sort of attaches itself to surfaces and so on. These are all really part of this this more detailed task in that sense, and things like ventilation in buildings and so on. So you can see the sort of physical geographical spread in terms of that. Now that's only one part of RAMP. It's quite an important part, I think, but there are other areas of tasks in RAMP, such as comorbidities, where, for example, people are being affected both by COVID-19 and other ailments of various sorts. So there are tasks of that sort within the committee. Okay, now let me just very quickly say that what we're talking about this afternoon is, I've just indicated it on this slide. We're talking about really movement and location at the sort of regional, national, metropolitan scale, basically, in this particular context. It's arguable that we should actually be connecting what's going on into this small spaces area a bit more to that scale. So they're quite closely linked in some sense. I should just list the groups of people in the small spaces area to give you an idea. Network Rail, these are from the volunteers who volunteered their services related to modelling the pandemic. Network Rail are mainly concerned with, what goes on in rail stations and in trains, basically, social distancing and so on. This whole question. Sainsbury's was involved in building a supermarket model, as indeed you can see on that list. CASA has been involved with CASA UCL with Tesco, basically. So Sainsbury's and Tesco's have both been involved in this. I've indicated quite strongly the City Modelling Lab at Arup and the Mass Motion Group and the Ordnance Survey, the Rapid Prototyping Team. There are, in fact, a couple of quite impressive modelling efforts with Arup, that's Jerry Casey and Claire Fram and Fred Sean, I think, and the Mass Motion Group, which is really their pedestrian modelling stuff. And then in Ordnance Survey, Jacob Rainbow and Jeremy Morley and various people have developed, again, an interesting a spatial pandemic model in a sense. So these are well worth exploring and indeed fit very well into the, although the fine scale, fit very well into the applied urban modelling. Connected Places Catapult, that's the, used to be the Future Cities Catapult and the Transport Catapult. I've been working with the Urban Analytics Group in terms of data and so on. BAE Systems, that's the British Aerospace Systems, have done work on packing people into small spaces. And then the Fire Safety Group at Ed Gallia, the Centre for Numerical Modelling and Process Analysis at University of Greenwich, have a whole series of fire safety models they've developed over many years. They've done some interesting work. And then Civil Engineering at UCL have an interesting project with Transport for London on measuring the virus on trains and buses and so on. PricewaterhouseCoopers have work looking at inside of buildings. And then last but not least, the Martin Centre, that's Jin Ring and I can't remember, Ying, you're going to have to remind me about it. It's Rainer, is it? Who's the lady who's worked on green spaces and so on. That's another aspect of Greater Baden, okay, yeah. On the small spaces. Okay, so that's really the range of things in the small spaces stuff. I'm going to finish just by giving you an indication of one of these examples. This is the supermarket infection problem. Nevo Cleary and Fabian Ying, who used to be at Oxford, Neve is a associate professor in CASA, have both worked on this supermarket model, and you can see the basic idea. I'm not going to sketch it in any detail, but basically those are the sort of aisles in a small supermarket. You can see that the notion of crowding and infection and so on, the notion of how you lay things out in the supermarket and then how you queue people to get into the supermarket and so on, were really quite significant things in the early days of the pandemic, basically. They worked with Tesco's, and this was the supermarket in question. I don't know where this supermarket is. It's probably quite a big one, basically, biggish one. It's not a Tesco Metro, but anyway, you can actually see the potential infections according to colour, basically, in terms of crowding in this supermarket. And clearly the number of people entering the supermarket and the way they splay out within it and the things they buy and so on are all issues that really relate to the sort of human contact. So that's an example of the small spaces stuff. I'm going to hand over now to Mark, who I believe is going to present himself in a video at this point. I'll hand back to you, Ying, because you're going to fire up the video, I guess, at this particular point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And obviously, if anybody wants to talk about some of the small spaces stuff, we'll be mainly concentrating now on urban analytics. Then we can do this at the end in terms of any question and answers and so on. Okay.
Great, thank you, Mike. It's really good actually to have this overview and to provide both the context and the purpose of of this work. And well, our very capable student host, Ying, is going to fire up the presentation, I believe. And Mark actually has very kindly recorded this presentation because he had a clash.
Everybody, I'm Mark.
And yeah, maybe you could swap the settings so that because currently we're seeing the presenters one. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, you could start now. And this is Professor Mark Birkin.
I'm Mark Birkin. I'm Professor of Spatial Analysis and Policy in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. And I'm also the Programme Director for Urban Analytics at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence in the United Kingdom. And what I'd like to do is to provide a brief introduction and overview to the urban analytics task in the RAMP programme. So I've included a slide here on the RAMP initiative. I won't dwell on this because I'm sure Mike Batty will already have provided some context for this programme. So just to note that the work we're talking about here today is based in one of a small number of 8 to 10 tasks or working groups which were formed by the Royal Society in its response to modelling the pandemic. And this particular activity is a joint initiative between the Royal Society and the Turing. This slide gives some pointers to the shape and motivation of the work. And so the key thing to note here is this emphasis on human social behaviour and contacts, and then mapping epidemiological models into that kind of behavioural context. So I think the really important aspect of this work is that we start from that consideration of behaviour, movement, contact patterns in which the conditions for transmission of the epidemic are going to take place, and work forwards from there, rather than starting with the epidemic itself and then maybe trying to build some of those conditions into it, which is the approach that most people will have originally and continued to adopt. And so, you know, I guess one of the broader purposes and points of all this then is that it enables a much stronger focus on the important geographical elements of the situation, which are often underrepresented or misrepresented in a number of scientific and policy applications. So this is particularly important in the current context. So, for example, in the UK, where we're thinking about tiering, about strategies on opening non-essential retail services, when are we going to close the bars, restaurants, all these kind of questions. Of course, we have various systems being discussed for different tiers at different levels of risk or infection and so forth, but really with insufficient apparatus for evaluation and consideration of the impacts of these kinds of decisions. I think, yeah, associated with that, if models do consider some of these spatial aspects, it's typically with relatively crude representation of spatial patterns, so things like circular catchment areas or people travelling to the nearest facilities. If people are thinking about interactions, then that may involve some consideration of commuting. There's been a lot of interest in schools, of course, but not a lot going any further than that in terms of behaviour and interaction patterns. And in terms of the demography, then in most models, if we're getting some level of age and sex disaggregation, it's unlikely to be typically going very much further than that. And this, I guess, is the key slide for my introductory talk. So here I'm presenting an overview of the structure and the different elements of our modelling approach, which we'll then be hearing about in the other talks. So at the top there, starting with the spatial microstimulation, a very detailed and comprehensive representation down to quite a fine neighbourhood scale of the population and households within the system of interest that we're going to be looking at. So representing those populations and households across different local areas and regions within the country. On the left-hand side, we'll then be thinking about enriching that spatial microsimulation and demographic database to add in more detailed elements relating to the health status of that population, their behaviour patterns in terms of the kinds of activities that they undertake, the time that they allocate to those different activities, and then moving into the right there, thinking more specifically about the spatial interaction, the movement patterns, where these activities take place, and crucially, of course, how that then brings people into contact with one another within various different retail environments or workplaces or in schools or in a variety of other contexts. And so then, as I said previously, it's when we've established this spatial and behavioural background to the situation, then we think about how we integrate all of that and introduce the virus and the epidemic modelling into the situation, and to see how that's going to get transmitted and diffused in space and time through the simulation and modelling environment. And just to note that we'll be hearing from a number of groups who've been responsible for the development of these individual model components, but also working together as a group to take forward this programme of work as an integrated package of activities addressing the pandemic and its implications. I don't want to keep you too long now from hearing about all the great work that my colleagues have been doing, but I would like to note in passing that the kind of work that we're talking about here, much of it has been drawn on foundations that were already underway at the start of the pandemic. And I think many of you will be able to see connections to some more conventional kind of approaches to land use and transport interaction modelling and that kind of thing. So here's a particular example that we were working on at the Turing at the start of the year before we started getting a bit distracted by COVID. So here's a particular scenario or situation thinking about the major infrastructure investment that's planned in a new expressway, improved transport infrastructure linking Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes. And so, the kinds of model architecture that we're thinking about here, the combination of microsimulation with understanding behaviour interaction patterns, whether it's commuting, retail activity, housing markets, all that kind of thing, it is work, of course, that is familiar to many of us in this kind of land use transport interaction modelling context. And I think it's worth making that point, even though these applications can look rather different, I guess, particularly to external observers. Not least in this kind of illustration, we may be thinking about infrastructure investments that taking 30, 40, 50 years in order to be fully realised, as opposed to the days or at best weeks or small months which we're thinking about in terms of COVID and the short-term health impacts and effects. And then also to mention very briefly that we'll also be seeing later in the presentations the demonstration of a capability to visualize and then ultimately to provide decision support and scenario-based analytics. And we're very grateful to our partners in Probable, working outside the academic and university sector on this implementation of the model, which we think is pointing in quite an exciting direction for further development, again with particular relevance and utility for these kind of policy applications in government and so forth. So just to recap briefly, we'll be looking at some models which are very spatially refined. They include mobility, social and space interaction, and an aspect that I've not dwelt on, but we may come back to, which can be calibrated to real behaviour patterns, ideally drawn from new kinds of big data sets on mobility, on retail interaction and choice, and those kinds of things. We are looking at a capability which goes a long way beyond workplaces and schools, but can certainly be thinking about how we incorporate retail, leisure, transport interactions and other things into our thinking and understanding. And we are dealing here with some quite refined and detailed demographic modelling and profiling tools, which again can go way beyond the sorts of age and sex disaggregations that we see in a lot of applications. And then it may be rather premature to conclude before you've heard all the details, but just to reflect on what may be some emerging lessons. I'm hoping that we're going to see here that these kind of behavioural models are really very valuable, at least as a complement to some of the epidemiological approaches. I think we're particularly focusing and interested in this idea of scenario analytics. How can we provide what-if type support to understand the effect of policy strategies and interventions? I've said already that we feel that the level of granularity and geography within these kinds of modelling approach is hugely important and significant. And finally, it would be nice to think that whatever happens with coronavirus, hopefully involving getting fully to grips with it very soon, one way or another, that there might be some longer term lessons for us here about the importance of such scenario analytics within modelling and simulation approaches, which could really help us in our thinking about other kinds of problems and issues that will still be with us, such as designing carbon zero cities or environments in which more healthy and active lifestyles can take place, and many other kinds of policy questions and issues over various time horizons. And with that, I'll hand you over to my colleagues and look forward to joining you in the discussion later on this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mark. And and I hope Mark actually will be able to join us later on from the session. And this may be a very good moment for me to actually hand over to Steve Denman, who is a colleague of mine in Cambridge in our cities and transport research group, and a research fellow in this group in the University of Cambridge, to chair the presenters, the presentations of the RAMP urban analytics model. Steve.
Thank you, Ying. Our next presentation today is from Nick Lomax, University of Leeds, and Karyn Morrissey from the University of Exeter. If I could ask Nick and Karyn to briefly introduce themselves before moving straight on to their presentation. So over to you, Nick and Karyn.
Hello, Steve. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. My name is Nick Lomax. I'm based at the University of Leeds, talking to you in a minute about the microsimulation model that we've been building. Karyn?
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Karyn Morrissey, and I'm an associate professor in population health in the University of Exeter.
Great. So, Steve, I hope that you can see my slides on the screen. Brilliant. So yes, thanks very much for having us. Very much hoping that this gives you an overview of the kind of start point of the RAMP models, because what we have been working on, myself, Karyn, and our colleague Jamil, who is going to be speaking later on as well, is building the attribute-rich population which is needed to be fed through to the whole suite of models which forms RAMP. So what we'll aim to do over the next 10 minutes is talk to you about our key objectives, which are to create a synthetic population at a fine geographical scale. We've done a lot of work around matching all of the data that we can get hold of in terms of augmenting our base demography so that we have those attributes that we need for all of the other models that form RAMP, and then understanding group and spatial patterns to inform the behavioural models. So I want to acknowledge that this is work that we didn't start from cold, thankfully. So starting with a project called the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium, which is an EPSRC funded project, and then continuing into some work which is being funded by the Alan Turing Institute. We've been developing a suite of models which allow us to do this synthetic data generation. So there's a whole host of things that have been going on in the past which have enabled us to get tooled up quite quickly to provide the data needed for RAMP. So we've got demographic estimates, and also we're producing projections of people, of households, and also people and households in dwellings. And in our previous work, we've had these data as inputs to a whole range of different things that we can model in terms of demand. So for example, digital communications, energy, solid waste, transport and water supply. So just to give you a bit of context that these populations can be used for kind of more broad application areas. And we produce populations at middle layer super output area scale. We then produce households at output area scale. And we run an algorithm which assigns people into households. So we have a very detailed link between the people who inhabit different households. And as I said, these can go into all kinds of demand models as inputs to other models that want to be run. So I shan't dwell too long on this slide. What I really want to do is just give you a feel for the 5 key phases of the synthetic generation of the population data. So there are a suite of packages that download data and provide consistency, because we build from official data like Office of National Statistics, mid-year estimates, for example. We then have that key phase, number 2, which is this generation of the synthetic populations, which is households and people. Phase 3 is that simulation, so it's actually a projection model that sits in the middle of this, which allows us to roll out to the future. Phase 4, we've got a range of custom scenarios that we can build, so depending on changes in things like local area housing. And then of course there's the output, which is key for RAMP and all of the other associated projects that we're working on. I should give a nod to my colleague Andrew Smith, who has built a lot of these packages. It's a whole suite of kind of modular packages that fit together to form the whole of Spencer, which is the estimation projection model. And just to flag up here that it's all open source and everything is available on GitHub to be used and downloaded and adapted. The key module within that whole suite of packages that does the work we need for RAMP is called humanleague. So what we have here is a spatial microsimulation package, which is built for R and for Python. There's a core implementation in there in C++, which means that it's a lot more efficient and quicker. We generate synthetic populations from marginal constraints, and there are two ways of actually producing those populations within the package. We've got a deterministic method called iterative proportional fitting, and a probabilistic method called quasi-random sampling. And then to give you a bit of a feel for what we get out the other end in terms of core demographic output, we've got age, sex, ethnic group, tenure, accommodation types, and of course that fine level spatial detail that we need. And it's very difficult to visualize what is effectively a whole suite of large CSV files, but you get the idea that once you start to aggregate these up over areas or over different groups, you can start to interrogate the spatial dynamics of population change, for example. So some graphs here showing the projection model running, changing population at national scale, and how age structures change, etc., as you roll the model forwards. So I'll stop there and hand over to Karyn, who's going to talk about the matching of additional attributes into the base Spencer data.
Thanks, Nick. And here's hoping that my dog behaves, but if not, bear with it. So having already developed 2 spatial microsimulation models throughout my career, I was more than happy that when Nick noted that he had one that was already on the boil, and this certainly made our life much, much easier over the last few months. However, whilst the synthetic population provides important baseline demographic and socioeconomic data, we also know that people lead very, very rich and varied lives, and that how they spend their time over the day or over a week and their behaviors attached to that vary hugely based on their age, their gender, their employment status, where they live, etc. So, and what we also know very early on from the pandemic, that these are all those key movements and how people interact with people determined people's exposure. So understanding how people move across their day based on their wider demographics was clearly essential to capture within any model, data-driven model, to model the pandemic. So if I can ask you to, great. So we needed to enrich Spencer's data set, and to do this in a very low cost way, rather than trying to bring everything back in under the hood, which we could do in the future with Spencer. We decided to use an external matching process called propensity score matching to match the data sets, other data sets that would have that valuable behavior and health data to the baseline Spencer data. These our main 2 data sets that we were interested in was the UK Time Use Survey from 2015, which had incredibly detailed breakdowns of how people spend their lives based on incredibly detailed employment information and various socio-demographic information. The second one, given the fact that we knew very early on in the pandemic that people's health status and particular health conditions such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease exasperated people's response to COVID, meant that we also needed detailed health data, which we got from the Health Survey of England. Nick. So effectively what we did was use propensity score matching, and I can lax lyrically about the ins and outs of this at another point or in follow-up emails, but to join both the Time Use Survey and the Health Survey of England to the Spencer dataset, both of which are nationally representative. Nick, can I ask you to go ahead? Brilliant. And what the outcome of that is a very detailed demographic, socioeconomic, health and time use for each individual that was in the Spencer model, with by household, by MSOA level, MSOA data. So we had that enriched data required to model people's exposure and their potential impact of getting COVID based on their socio-demographic characteristics. Can I ask you? Yeah, great. So I note that one of the main things that we were interested in is how this divvied up over space. And it's quite obvious now why that's important. But back when we first started this, not many people, as Mike was saying, were focusing on the spatial distribution. And I just want to demonstrate here, this is some of the output that the PSM and the enriched Spencer data set allows us to produce. We have things like average time spent at home at the MSOA, the spatial distribution of average, how much time people spend at work. And you can see there's huge variation. The percentage of key workers, we matched the CASA. Provided information on which sick codes were deemed to be key workers, and we matched that into our simulated data set, and also the various underlying health conditions. And yeah, great, thank you. And we focused a lot of our research, and Gavin, our colleague, will explain why, in the first instance on Devon, mainly, of course, like all good data scientists, because we had the data there. So what we ended up with was an incredibly flexible data, baseline data set that contained the necessary data required to look at people's exposure, not just their exposure to COVID, but also if they got COVID, what their potentially what their circumstances would be. So that brings us to a close. Oh, and just my piece de resistance. I just want to show you the validation part, which is of course key. And what you see is on the Devon census for 2011, you have the INSEC, which is socioeconomic status, and the average produced by the PSM, and this is great for socioeconomic status, but this was a matched variable. So one would hope that you get a good match. However, what's really interesting is that the breakdown by produced by the propensity score matching is quite similar for very good for general health. So we're really quite proud of that. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Karyn, for that very clear and concise overview of the microsimulation. We have no immediate questions from the audience. Unless there's anything immediate from the panel, we'll move straight on to the next presentation. The next presentation is from Adam Dennett and Richard Milton from University College London. And they're going to look at their work on modelling spaces. If I could ask Adam and Richard to introduce themselves briefly and then move straight on to their presentation.
Sure, thanks, Steve. Let me see if I can share the screen first. We're going to have that hurdle, and then I'll do a little introduction. Let me see. Okay, how is that?
Yeah, that's good.
Good, okay. Great, right. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Adam Dennett. I'm Associate Professor in CASA, currently Head of Department, and been working with Richard, and who will introduce himself in a minute, and Mike Batty on the kind of behavioural modelling part of the larger model. So this is kind of the bit where we send people that Nick and Karyn have created to places to infect each other with COVID. Richard, do you want to introduce yourself at this point?
Yeah, sure. Hi there, I'm Richard Milton. I'm a computer scientist. I work on the Quant project with CASA, and I'm on secondment to the Alan Turing Institute at the moment. So Quant is Mike's spatial interaction model, the innards of which are used to do the ramp work.
Okay, so I'll give a sort of a brief overview of sort of where we're coming from, what we did. Richard will dive into a bit more of the detail as he kind of really did the hard work of getting the sort of the model implemented. But, you know, as we're all sitting here at home, I think we're probably all now acutely aware that airborne diseases like COVID, flu, things like that are essentially diseases of spatial interaction. So people kind of moving around, meeting each other, are essentially the things that these viruses thrive on. And of course, people carry out their daily activities in different ways, depending on who they are, where they live, the sorts of how old they are, the kind of jobs they do. All of these things have an influence on where they might go in any given day or any given week, the kind of other people they might interact with, and therefore the probability of becoming infected with a disease like COVID-19. Now, of course, there's virtually an infinite number of places that people could interact with in any given day. We thought we'd focus on some of the more common sites of potential human interaction and disease transmission. Of course, you know, homes is the first one. People, you know, something like about 70% apparently of COVID transmission occurs within where someone lives. Workplaces that have had varying levels of importance as we've gone through the pandemic, depending on the level of lockdown, and the sorts of work that you do has a very sort of big influence on the kind of people you're going to interact with and your probability of getting disease. For school children, schools clearly are sort of one of the most important sites of interacting with other people. And then we've all got the kind of things that most of us will kind of go to on any given day, like a supermarket maybe, or a pub or a restaurant. We may take public transport, go to a gym or a leisure centre. There's also occasionally we may visit hospitals, and certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, I think certainly less so at this point, but at the beginning of the pandemic, hospitals were one of these key places potentially of disease transmission. So yeah, as I mentioned, you know, the variations in demography will affect interaction, but also something that's very important is that we do have a clear geography to all of these sorts of things in the United Kingdom. So local spatial configurations of supermarkets and, you know, workplaces, these sorts of things are going to have an influence. They're going to interact with demographic profiles, socioeconomic profiles, and have an influence on the disease spread. And you see this, you know, in all of the news stories that we've been watching over the last few months, where, you know, in the UK we're getting local lockdowns in different parts of the country. There was a sort of big surge of COVID-19 a month or so two ago in the north. It's now kind of surging down in Kent. And so all of these sort of different spatial patterns are very, very important if you're going to try and tackle the pandemic. So our job was really to try and see if we could get a handle on this a little bit. Another thing to mention is that the temporal interaction is very important. So the sort of site that you visit is going to create different levels of exposure. So you might just make a very brief trip to the supermarket. You know, corner shop might last 10 minutes. However, you might spend all day in a school. So, you know, all of these things are going to be interacting to create these different sort of risk profiles in different places of interaction. But really, you know, all other things being equal, the evolution of the disease is going to be some sort of function of these population interactions at these different sites. So we had a challenge really at the beginning of the project, and this challenge was really, if we know where people live, and we do, because from Nick and Karyn's excellent microsimulation work, we have a very good synthetic population. Can we say something about where they might go? So depending on their profiles, depending on the configuration of these different sites in the local area, can we say something about where they might go during their daily and weekly activities, and what sort of exposure to COVID-19 disease risk might they experience as a result of this? So we took an approach that we were familiar with, and we used effectively sort of gravity or spatial interaction models, which are sort of very well established methodology for estimating flows between different residential areas. These interactions are going to vary according to the different sizes of the residential populations in the residential zones, the relative attractiveness of different shops or schools or hospitals, and the relative cost of travelling between the home location and the site of interaction. For those of you who like seeing algebraic expressions of models, this is effectively the model we ended up applying. So we have on the left there a TIJ term, which is the transition or trip, the flow of a person between their origin, their home location, and their destination, whether it's the supermarket, school, etc. This flow is proportional to all of the stuff on the right-hand side of this equation. So proportional to OI, so a vector of attributes at the origin. So this is a kind of known residential populations, maybe disaggregated by different population types. We've got our attractiveness factors at the destination. So, you know, the size of the supermarket. We've used things like this, the numbers of pupils on the school roll to estimate, you know, how attractive different schools are to different groups of young people in residential areas. All of these flows are inversely proportional to the cost of travelling between the residential home location and the destination. So we have a CIJ term there, which is our sort of cost of travel. So frequently we use things like distances. You could also use travel time, financial cost, that sort of thing. We've got a couple of parameters in there which are to be estimated if we're able to get some data to calibrate on. And we can reformulate this model and effectively take a sort of a ratio to derive flow probability. So in this exercise, and Richard will explain a bit more, we were effectively deriving probabilities of people interacting with these different sites, and these were then feeding back into the microsimulation model. We have a few health warnings that just sort of to flag in terms of the limitations of what we did. So the model will estimate a probability of individuals visiting a particular site from a particular residential zone. It won't capture any of the sort of variations in daily or weekly trips and different types of site at the moment. So that this is maybe, you know, something that we could look at in a bit more detail in the future. What we don't have, again, at the moment, we were just doing kind of general probabilities of interaction. You know, at a later stage, it'd be nice if we can start to disaggregate these probabilities of interaction by the types of individual in these different places. So families of children, how do they interact with supermarkets compared to, you know, lone pensioners, for example. And where we didn't have any data sets of observed flows, our calibration was made a little bit more tricky, but Richard will talk a bit about some of the things that we were able to do to try and calibrate these models as best we could. In terms of our system, this is what our system looks like. I've zoomed in on Devon here because a lot of the earlier work that the group was doing focused in on Devon. But we have a system of middle layer super output areas. So these are the zones that you see there. Each of these MSOAs has a centroid that we've taken as our sort of point of departure, if you like, for our kind of populations that were going places. So these are our effectively populations assigned to these zone centroids. So these are our OIs in our model. We then send them to different sorts of place. So here we've got supermarkets. These were supplied by Geolytics, and they were kind enough to give us some additional data on things like estimated spend of these supermarkets. So we had some sort of level of attractiveness. Here I've got size bands, and again we can use sort of size as a sort of proxy for how attractive a supermarket is. We've got things like hospitals in there as well. We've got schools, so we had all of the primary school and secondary school data from Department for Education. And again, with school rolls, those circles are proportional to the size of the school roll. So again, we have a sort of a sense of how attractive any of these places are going to be. We can send people between these origins and destinations along the road network. And again, Richard will talk in a minute about how we were able to do this. If we're doing the whole of England and Wales, we've got a very large cost matrix, and there are a few creative things that we needed to do to make this more manageable. Okay, I'll now sort of hand over to Richard to go into a bit more detail.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Okay, so just to state the model, it's a zone to point model where the zones are the MSOA, middle layer super output area zones, or the IZ intermediate zones in Scotland. So that's the origin is an MSOA zone, and the destination is a point. So it's either a geolytics retail point from the geolytics open data for retail locations, or it's a school point, primary or secondary, or it's a hospital. Now, as Adam said, there's a beta parameter in here, which is a calibration parameter. We take that from the quant model, which is calibrated on a travel to work model. So we can actually change the distance decay function and the cost function so that we get trips that are representative of what you would expect of a trip to the shop or a trip to hospital or a trip to the school. So we can see them coming, we can see the average trip times coming out in the kind of zone that we would expect it to. Can we have the next slide, please,
yeah.
Adam? Okay, so now I'm going to show you the data very quickly. So this is the geolytics data. The points here are actually the geolytics points. These are the retail points. So the dots are the origin, sorry, the dots are the destination points. The origins are where the lines start, and the lines are actually drawn in a color proportional to the probability of the trip. So we have every MSOA, of which there are 8,436 in the UK, going to every one of 14,000 points. And now in order to do this, we move people around on the road network. So we're actually using the calibrated quant model that we calibrate on the travel time to work that the quant model is calibrated from. So we can use the shortest path from that as well, because we potentially got 8,400 zones going to 14,000 points. When you multiply that up, that's I think it's something like 140 million different shortest paths that we would have to run. So what we do, we've already got the MSOA to MSOA costs. So we run origin MSOA to nearest destination MSOA, and then run a correction from the destination to the nearest point, to to all the points. So that avoids us having to do any large scale calculations. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So this slide is the same data, but I've taken the points off. So what you can see here are the colors, which are the probabilities of the trips. Now, there's a cut, which is, I can't remember what the probability of the cut is. It's 0.005, no, sorry, 0.009, so almost 0.001. These probabilities are spread over all of the geolytics retail points. But you notice in London, the probabilities are very low, because you can see that all the lines there are showing blue lines. So red is the highest probabilities of trips, green is somewhere in the middle, and then you go down to the blue. And this comes about because the density of retail points in London and also around a lot of the other major cities is much higher. So you've got the similar numbers of people being spread across just larger numbers of retail points. So it thins out the probabilities. There's another interesting thing you can do with this, because the data is essentially a fully connected graph of trip probabilities. So you can do the network graph trick where you set a threshold and do the network graph diffusion, set the threshold at 0 and draw all the probabilities of trips greater than the threshold, and then just creep that threshold up and see how this forms into different clusters. And those are the clusters that you are going to see the virus move around in, because those are the more connected clusters. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is the same thing for the schools. Now, if you look at Wales, there's something wrong with Wales. I left this in deliberately because it shows that the biggest problem with all of this data was actually connecting the UK back up again. We've got data for England in one set of files, data for Wales in another, and data for Scotland in another. And I spent most of my time actually finding data that was the same data for the different countries of the UK, and then stitching it all back together to make a connected UK again. In this particular instance, for some reason, the schools data was missing Wales. So all of the Welsh school children have been propagated to schools that are in England. But you can see the difference between primary and secondary schools, just in terms of numbers of schools and the distance that people travel. You know, you've got 18,000 primary schools and 500,000 pupils, whereas you've got, 3 million secondary pupils and 3,500 schools. You can see the, vast difference between those probabilities. There's some interesting detail on some of the primary schools in East Anglia and up that section of the UK. And then London, again, much higher density of schools, virtually nothing. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And then finally, we've got the hospitals. So in terms of magnitude, we've gone from 14,000 retail points to 3,000 or 4,000 or so schools to a few hundred hospitals. And you can see the effect that that has. Now, we've got two hospital models. This is a simple one, and it just propagates people based on numbers. So our source data is numbers of people in each MSOA being propagated to hospitals on the basis of how many people that hospital has treated. We can disaggregate this down, and we can do a much more complicated model. We've got the hospital data, so we can disaggregate it by age, group, and sex. And then we can do the same thing for the MSOAs as well. I mean, we can disaggregate the MSOAs into any age distribution that we want. And with that, that's the end of our presentation.
Yeah, I think that's us. Yeah, thank you.
That's done.
Thank you, Adam and Richard. Very interesting, very clear and concise again. I'll now invite our next set of speakers. I think this will be led by Jamil Noor from the Martin Centre. If I could ask Jamil and Shanshan and Ying to again introduce themselves briefly before moving straight on to their presentation. Jamil?
Thank you, Steve. My name is Jamil Noor. I'm a research associate at the Martin Centre, working with Dr. Ying and Shanshan.
Hi, I'm Shanshan. I'm a PhD candidate working with Jamil and Ying on this project. I'm doing the modeling of the workplace destination and travel mode choice of the individuals in the PSM data set. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm Ying Jane, and I'm very proud to be part of this team, and they have done hard work, and I really enjoyed working with them. Yeah, getting back to you, Jamil.
Thank you, Ying. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll try to be concise because my colleagues have already presented a wide overview and details that make it easier for me to go to this next module, which is the modeling journeys to work and the missed premises. This is a collective work done by myself, Stephen Denman, the chair, Shanshan, Ying Jin, and our colleague at the Department of Land Economy in Cambridge, Dr. Lee Wan. Yes, so generally the aim of this section and overall the ramp work is to use pre-COVID models and observations to develop adaptive models for post-COVID commute behavior predictions, which are then going to be used as input for an epidemiological SAYER model, which is the acronym for susceptible, exposed, infected, recover, which is the standard model that is used in epidemiological studies. And we're going to look at what drives commuting flows. For instance, here there is an image produced by our colleague Steve on the different impact of different mode splits, car, motorbike, public transport in the Cambridge area. And this is a recent work done by Dr. Kaveh Jahanshahi at the ONS and Martin Centre, Dr. Jean, on the classification, nationwide classification of commuting according to latent geographies. We're going to try to introduce some of these techniques into the commuting modeling and how to adapt it to the SARE framework. So in general, for those who are less familiar with the commuting part, the challenge is when creating a modeling for commuting, a model for commuting that the coexistence of several sides. On the one side is there are the resident workers, which is known as the employment by resident. On the other side, there are jobs, which are the employment by workplace, that they do not necessarily coincide for a variety of reasons. And then clearly the flows that go from residents to jobs, and which will vary according whether we consider the region of a study as open to commuting or closed, from migration or commuting or closed. And of course, the type of workplace will be different. It could be people would have a usual workplace, say their office, or they could have employment that are not characterized by a fixed workplace. And some of them could be structurally working from home. And furthermore, clearly there's a possible segmentation of workflows by industry, by occupation, and this segmentation will see how it could have an impact on the infection risk. And borrowing from the labor economics literature, we're going to consider mainly two aspects of the modeling, which is from the margins point of view, the extensive margin and the intensive margin. The extensive margin is whether you work or not. Once you've taken this decision, what this implies to the work frequency, the type of work, and the spatial distribution. And then of course the intensive margin is once you decided to work, how much how long do you work, what are your schedules. Just to provide a couple of examples from the time survey that Karyn has introduced before, of how intensive and extensive margin interact. We can see here, this is the share of the day spent at home for almost 8,000 individuals. And we can see how the distribution changes substantially according to the working pre-COVID working status of individuals. We see that, you know, full-time employees, like 25 up to 50% already have spent half of the day in work, while, you know, the unemployed, the most of their time, or they retire, most of their time they spend it at home, while this is the general distribution. And the work duration to the intensive margin also varies substantially by occupation. This is again pre-COVID data. We can see, for instance, how process plant and machine operatives are concentrated around the 8 hours time. This is in minutes, while other professions such as you know, caring and leisure are more spread out around the distribution. So this total distribution really can be disaggregated across occupations. But how can we link work dynamics to disease spread, which is major focus of the RAMP work, where commuting patterns are, as we have seen, characterized by a great heterogeneity, and different work profiles carry different exposure risks. In particular, exposure risks may vary significantly across industries and occupations. One potential measure to account for this variation is physical proximity on the workplace. And the ONS has created a proximity index at the industry division, so aggregates the 90 categories into 7 categories using the standard industry classification from 2007. And it's clear that if there exists a spatial concentration of dense firms in a certain sensitive industry, this will probably increase the potential disease spread. And the framework of RAMP, in particular the microsimulation sections, allows, so the enriched propensity score matching framework allows to explore how pre-COVID workplaces could interact with disease infection. So let's consider one of such examples. This is a snapshot from the Devon area. So we can see on the y-axis, we have all the Devon local authorities, and all these points are MSOA points for each local authority. So Exeter will have 11 points. And on the x-axis is the MSOA average industry proximity index for all industries together. We can see that there is quite a lot of heterogeneity, although if you look at the absolute values, this heterogeneity is included between sort of 3 percentage points of this proximity index. So if we only look at the aggregate employment without disaggregating by industries, we lose potentially a lot of heterogeneity. And this can be seen by this graph, which is a little bit dense, but I will explain in detail. So on the on the y-axis, we have the industry divisions, 70 categories. On the x-axis, we have the, for the whole of the Devon region, the mean. So this is across all MSOAs. We average the risk by all MSOAs by a given industry. And this is the result. The size of the bubble is the frequency of that industry in the Devon region. So there are 107 MSOAs in the Devon region. So this means the biggest bubble means that this sector, which is human health activities, is present in all of the 107 MSOAs, while veterinary activities in present is probably just a few of them. And we can see already from this graph that the heterogeneity in industry proximity, physical proximity, hugely varies by industry. There's a further element to this, however, which is going to be seen by introducing another panel on this graph. This graph, instead of the average Devon information, shows information for every single MSOA in Devon. So there are 107 MSOAs. This means that for each sector, these are 107 concentric circles. And we can see, first of all, that the size of the circles vary for the same industries across MSOAs, where the size of the bubble is the employment size in that MSOA. And we can also see that some sectors, although looked like present in several MSOAs, such as computer programming and consultancy, once we account for the effective number of employees of employment in that sector, we can see that, you know, this bubble, for instance, almost disappears. So not only there is industry heterogeneity, but there exists a strong geographical heterogeneity, which we try to capture within the RAMP framework. In terms of the modeling itself, what comes in and out from the commuting model? So the available input data sets that we use are the census, flows, so residents, workers, and jobs from 2011, jobs data from the Business Register Employment Survey from 2019, the enriched PSM data that was presented by Karyn and Nick earlier. So Spencer, the demographics-based Spencer, enriched through the Health Survey of England and the Time Use Survey, and then additional force-based data from the Valuation Office Agency and the Energy Institute provided kindly by the UCL. In terms of model output, we aim to model individual and possibly segmented commuting probabilities and aggregate and possibly segmented commuting flows. And the model output from the commuting model will constitute the part of the Sayer input for the framework that Mike and Mark had discussed earlier. In terms of the individual commuting choice model, the current approach that we have adopted is to have a doubly constrained origin destination IJ spatial interaction multinomial logic, in which we have individual segmentation at the socioeconomic group, and in which we calibrate attractiveness parameters at the IJ level, first calibrated on the 2011 census flows for 2011, then taken forward to 2020 with updates, jobs, PSM, so 2019 and 2020. And then the model is calibrated along the betas, and we have, from original model existed at the local authority level, we have put it to fit the middle output, middle super output area level, MSOA. And the model takes into account rent costs and transport costs and distances, where we use employment residents from the census, which take into account pre-COVID work will have reduced but similar patterns to those with a fixed work location. We are able also to provide mode choice estimation by car, bus, rail, walking, and cycling, thanks to the input of distance and cost modeled by Quant from UCL, and also implementing with Google travel costs. And all of this will become current input to Sayer, so the individual commuting choice model with model split. The second input to the same model is the aggregate flows. So we start from the estimated individual commuting probabilities. And then for each home origin, we consider the top 30 commuting destinations. From the PSM, on the other hand, from the propensity score match data, so the enriched data, we know the individual industry section for each individual. So it's 21 categories. And so we sum all these fractions by the industry to create industry flows. And then we can verify them with the breast jobs information. This is verification, not validation, because we already have used breast as an input in the multinomial logic model. And so this becomes the second input to the same model, which is the flows and the modes aggregate. What we're trying to do now is to update this framework by changing the nature of the aggregate double constraints moving to occupations. And to do so, we are using an occupation by residence, which is the major groups, 9 categories, and occupation from jobs at the industry division. So the challenge from the jobs point of view is that the breast only has industry data, employment data at the industry level, but has no information on the occupation in each industry. So from the employer skills survey, we are able to use this survey that contains 92,000 firms with detailed size and occupation distribution to reconstruct occupation levels by industry. And then we use this new level of occupations from the workplace side and the occupation by residents from PSM to have new constraints for working residents and jobs in a way so that we can update the 2011 flows and have a new matrix that will be used to calibrate the original individual multinomial logic model. And this is just an example of this technique of applying occupation shares to job levels to obtain occupation levels. We can see here for the Devon area. So on the legend, you have the different colors correspond to the different occupations. For instance, this is managers, professionals, associate professionals, advertising, customer, skill trade, care and leisure, sales, machine operatives, and elementary occupations. And we can see already at this very aggregate level, when we have on the x-axis the mean workers, number of mean workers across every MSOA in Devon, and on the y-axis, the SIC section, so 21 categories here, 19, we can see already that the distribution of occupations varies greatly according to the SIC considered. So occupation has a great concentration on care and education has a great concentration on care and leisure, while wholesale retail, in particular retail, concentrates on sale and customer care as expected, and accommodation and food services has a high percentage of elementary occupations. And clearly, something that we're trying to incorporate at some point, which is what also Mark was saying about the dynamics of post-work interactions and in also leisure patterns, etc., is joining. So in work time and post-work, for instance, shopping and leisure interaction by amenities. This is a map by of Exeter when we have used the company house data to approximately locate different venues, and different venues are, for instance, licensed restaurants, pubs, and we can see that each MSOA has a different concentration, with most of these venues concentrated in the center, but also, so this is an important element to consider, high concentration of these type of venues in areas with, that host business parks. Just to conclude, what are the ongoing updates of our work and possible future work? Well, we'll try to shift our focus on post-pandemic adaptations. In particular, first of all, we want to obtain an individual multinomial choice model that is segmented by occupation and industry. And we plan to disaggregate workplaces such that we are able to adopt local firm size profiles. We have a variety of data sets that carry information on the size band of firms in a given industry. The aforementioned employment skills survey, but also the UK business count, which is a snapshot of the IDBR. And then we have information on the number of colleagues, first and foremost from the time use survey and also complementarily from the labor force survey. And one area in which we are focusing on is modeling the decision to travel, so traveling versus staying home. And in particular, the travel to work decision is going to be influenced by the possibility of teleworking. And we're going to try to analyze post-COVID patterns to modify the calibration of the model. And thanks to this framework, we can possibly run policy scenarios. For instance, what is the effect of following on worker flows? What if we shut down certain industry sectors in the economy? And it's important to consider that everything will be derived with the objective to be an input for the SAIR model, so they can be as accurate as possible. And this will allow, for instance, the policy scenarios to consider consequent change in contagion patterns, and most importantly, have reflections. I will leave this point open, maybe for discussion, on the possible existence of a post-COVID world according to the future permanence of the current trends and the possibility of a rollout of a vaccine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jamil. It's excellent to see the huge amount of progress that's been made in such a short space of time by yourself and the team and all contributors today. And also how well all the elements fit together. So we've gone from modelling at the micro scale, so we're looking at generation of synthetic populations, to looking at how people travel, both in terms of essential non-work trips and also commuting. And now we're going to go back to looking at the micro scale and how we may simulate COVID-19 in the community. So I'm going to ask Gavin, Shaddick and Fiona Spooner from the University of Exeter, to briefly introduce themselves and then move straight on to their presentation.
Hi, thank you. Fiona, can you share your screen?
Yep, sure.
Brilliant. So while we get the first slide up, thank you for the opportunity to present this final kind of bringing things together presentation. My name is Gavin Shaddick, and I'm Professor of Data Science and Statistics at the University of Exeter. I'll let Fiona introduce herself.
Is that sharing the right screen?
No, I think that's that's your screen.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
That's better.
There we go. Yep, I'm Fiona Spooner. I am a postdoc working at the University of Exeter.
And this particular piece of work is a collaborative piece of work within an enormous collaboration, as you've seen so far. Other people who've contributed strongly, as well as the other presenters and their groups you've seen today: Nick Mallison at the University of Leeds, Jesse Abrams at Exeter, Natalie Nielsen at Leeds, and also Charlie Stenton and Rory Gregg from Improbable. And this presentation is really a chance to see how we brought together the elements from spatial interactive models, microsimulation, synthetic populations, and used them as part of a epidemiological model tracking the progress, or maybe that's too positive a word, of COVID-19 within the community, and also offer us the facility and the opportunity now to look at the effects of different mitigation strategies, control strategies, and going forward, as Mark mentioned right at the very beginning, to look at how we might balance things like different tiers with vaccinations in different areas and things. So if you could change the slide, please, Fiona. So a quick outline of the presentation. First, we'll talk about the general integration framework, how we pull the individual pieces that you've heard about together. And then we will show you how the model has been used to simulate the spread of COVID-19 in Devon, and also the effect of lockdown on the spread of the disease. Also gives us the opportunity to change when lockdown is and the nature of lockdown to see what those effects might have been. Karyn a while ago said we might explain why we chose Devon, and that's largely because we live and work there. Actually, Karyn and Fiona don't, they live and work in Cornwall, but let's just say Exeter is in Devon. And also some of this work at the very beginning was based on some requests from the Chief Medical Officer of the local NHS to look into various aspects of the disease within the local area. So we started off looking at Devon. We now have the capability of looking at other areas within the country, but we'll show the examples and results from Devon. Then we'll look at the simulation framework and then some scenarios, as in some results of a case study, and then the dashboard, how the outputs of the model formulate, and then the really exciting bit, Fiona is going to show us an example of real-time computation based on the work we've been doing with Improbable. And then if we get time at the end, we'll look at some potential future developments. Next slide, please, Fiona. And indeed, over to you.
So yes, you might recognize this slide from Mark's presentation. So it's essentially a visual representation of all the data that the team has worked on and pulled together and gets input into the dynamic microsimulation model. So essentially we have a really rich data set, basically a row for each person in Devon. We've got demographic information, employment information, health data, and time use data. So we know how and where people spend their time. So as you can imagine, this is a really useful tool for modelling a disease outbreak and looking at different scenarios. So for example, we could shut down schools and workplaces and look at the effect of that, or we could look at the effect of improving the general health of the population and if that would affect the severity of the disease outbreak. So yeah, I'll just talk about the dynamic microsimulation in a bit more detail. So there are 3 stages which iterate on a daily basis, but the first stage, stage 0, is how we initialize the model. So initially in the population, no one has COVID, everyone is susceptible to COVID, but for the first 10 days we seed cases in the population, and we take that from PHE data, so based on real data, and we seed those cases in areas we think that the outbreak probably started, so more densely populated areas, richer areas, and areas which are better connected. And we randomly select people which are generally out of the house more and seed the cases with those. So after 10 days of seeding, we have quite a bit of COVID in the population, and the currency that we work in is hazard. So we say it has a 1 hazard. And as infected people travel to different venues and locations, they leave their hazard there. So if a location is visited by a lot of infected individuals, it will accumulate a lot of hazard on a daily basis. And then in the next stage, anyone that hasn't been infected yet with COVID, anyone that's still susceptible, visits these venues and they can pick up hazard depending on how much time they spend there and how many infected people have left hazard there. And then in the third stage, which Gavin will talk about more in a second, is the disease estimation stage. So we convert the hazard that people have accumulated from visiting venues and turn that into a probability of becoming infected with COVID. And as people get infected, they then therefore carry hazard and distribute that back into the population back when it goes around to stage 1. So if we look at that, at what that means on an individual person level, so this person spends 65% of their time at home, 30% at work, and 5% in retail venues. And if those different activities, there are different possible venues that they can go to. So for retail, there are 4 possible venues that this individual might visit, and there are different flow estimates for these venues. So for a given venue, so venue 98, there's a 5% chance that they will be spending their time in retail, and there's a 7% chance that they'll go to venue 98. So for their hazard that is left at venue 98, you take the hazard, multiply it by 0.05 and 0.07 to get the hazard that is left at venue 98 by this individual. So I'll pass back to Gavin now to talk more about what happens when someone is infected.
Thanks, Fiona. So as Fiona mentioned, that we update the disease status of every individual in the population of Devon, in this case, each day. And as it seems a long time ago now, but I think at the very first presentation, it was mentioned that we had an SEIR model. And so initially, we have cases in the population, but we have a lot of susceptible people. They then become exposed to the disease. And then there's kind of two states. Each people will get the disease, in that case become exposed, based on a probability that comes from a Bernoulli distribution, and that's essentially based on those exposures and hazards that they experienced that Fiona mentioned. Then individuals can either be pre-symptomatic, which means at some point they're going to have symptoms, kind of traditionally have the disease, or they may be asymptomatic. And the probability of both of those is based on an allocation with the parameters from literature and also local knowledge. If you are symptomatic, then we would certainly hope that you change your behavior. This would be kind of showing symptoms. You would be sent home from work. You should go and self-isolate. Now, of course, you would get a test to see whether those symptoms were actually indicative of having COVID or a different disease. And we would allocate a length of time that people would be symptomatic, again, a statistical distribution, in this case, the normal distribution. After having the disease, ignoring at this point things like long COVID, you would then be removed from the susceptible population. We are still working on the hopeful basis that people only get COVID once. If you could press the next one. And oh no, sorry. And that asymptomatic, symptomatic, and those probabilities are all based on, or at least can vary depending on your age and also your existing health status, coming from the Health Survey of England propensity score matching that Karyn mentioned, and that will determine things like whether you actually recover from the disease or whether, unfortunately, people die from the disease. When you are an infected individual, whether you have the disease, whether you're symptomatic before you go home to isolate, or whether you're asymptomatic and you don't know you have the disease, you will then, as Fiona explained, impart hazard to locations. Those hazards build up and then will be part of the probability that other susceptible people have the disease when they visit those locations. Next slide, please, Fiona. And in terms of our case studies, in this case, we're going to show two scenarios based on changing lockdown. One thing we need to do, of course, is to model lockdown itself. And I'll probably hand over after the first point to Fiona to explain exactly how we use Google Mobility to actually, in some ways, invent a lockdown that we can control. And this looked at trends in movement over time in different retail and other locations. And we used this information to look at what happened over the lockdown period that in the calendar time when it actually happened, and then use that information to be able to change the location, or at least location in time of lockdown. And I'll hand over to Fiona now to give some more details of how we actually did that in practice.
Yeah, so we know where people spend their time in a model, so we know the amount of time spent at home. So we basically, and not home, so we split it into you're either at home or you're not at home, you're outside. And there's similar breakdowns for the Google Mobility data, although slightly different. So we took everything that was residential for the Google Mobility and lumped it, like the retail and recreation, groceries, parks and transit stations together as not being at home. And then we looked at the average amount of time your average Devon citizen spends at home, which I think was about 75%. And then just calculated a multiplier by how much that had increased by over the lockdown period, and then a similar multiplier for how the time outside the home had decreased according to the Google mobility data for Devon.
We did several sense checks and kind of calibration model. One, back in the old days when data was kind of hard to come by, we looked at PHE cases, Pillar 1 cases. These are tests that at the time were only in hospitals generally. And we modeled a delay between someone actually getting the disease, because of course we're modeling the actual disease transmission in the population. So at that case, there would be someone getting COVID, and then there will be a chance that they're serious enough to go to hospital and then get a disease, a positive test result. We based this kind of calibration on both nationally available data at the time, but also on clinical input from our colleagues in the NHS. And at the time, back in the first lockdown, they suggested that the prevalence in the population would be about 2%. That's now been updated, as you can imagine, as time's gone by. But just please bear in mind, when we look at our lockdown results, this is the lockdown and the kind of state of play we're trying to recreate back in those early days. Next slide, please, Fiona. And here we can see using our model lockdown, actually when lockdown was implemented, and we can see the number of daily cases. As we mentioned, this is all based on kind of stochastic modeling with probability distribution. So we run the model several times, and the red line there is the median from a number of different runs. And you can see the number of cases, daily cases, increasing and then decreasing as the effect of lockdown 1, I guess we have to call it now, kind of cut in. And one of the very exciting things about the new computational implementation that Fiona will show at the end is, in order to run this model multiple times to get some idea of the uncertainty and also to allow for those stochastic elements, at this point, using the first implementation would take an awful long time. I'll hand over to Fiona at some point to describe the kind of increases in computational efficiency, but certainly running this for more than 2 months in a time was a computational challenge, something that certainly is no longer the case. But if you can just bear in mind that this is the effect of lockdown modeled by our Google Mobility lockdown at the actual time lockdown took place. And then in the next slide, we see the difference in the number of cases, quite dramatic difference if lockdown had been implemented 1 week earlier. So this would have been reducing the number of hours that people spent outside of their home, with a corresponding reduction in the number of interactions in those different locations, such as retail, etc. And then you can see a quite substantial reduction in the median number of cases per day, and also the kind of amount of time it took to recover if lockdown had been implemented 1 week earlier. And then in the next slide, the slide that's missing, actually, a more Boris-friendly slide in some case, was actually we have now run the model if lockdown had been a week later, and we see a corresponding rather dramatic increase in the number of cases and a longer period of time before things got back into control. The model, as Fiona mentioned earlier, has a rich set of outputs, not just those kind of those lines which show the number of daily cases, but also the number of cases by age and other demographics by those vulnerable populations. And one of the outputs of the model is a series of dashboards that allow you to look at the comparison between 2 scenarios. These are available on GitHub, and you can see the address at the bottom, and they're built using Python dashboarding. And on the next slide, we can see just some of the example outputs that you can look at different scenarios, compare them in different look at the number of people in each of the disease states, the SEIR. You can look at the spread of the disease in different places. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner the kind of danger scores, or those hazards that build up in different locations, in this case retail. And we can see on the left-hand side where the danger or the hazards tends to accumulate in primary schools, secondary schools, retail, work and home. And I think this is one of the really important and really valuable contributions this model makes, that we could actually start to look at quite fine details of different control measures. So not just locking down an entire area, but if we did shut down schools, for example, versus not shutting down schools, and looking in the future how this might interact with vaccinations being available and taken up in the populations in different areas. Next slide, please. And as well as kind of graphs and things, and I'm not sure this is actually animated, but you can see a sliding scale above those plots on the right hand side, those maps, and we can see the spatial distribution of the number of COVID cases over time, and also, as you can see on the left hand side, the kind of increase in the number of people exposed, symptomatic and non-symptomatic. And also what we'd like to see, of course, is immunity in the population, number of people who've been removed. So a reduction in the number of susceptible people, certainly that would be the case with vaccination, and the number of people who therefore have immunity either through vaccination or having had the disease. Next slide, please, Fiona. And I think now over to you for hopefully a technically seamless live demonstration.
Okey-doke. Let me just share a different screen. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so this you'll probably recognize, as we've seen this shape a few times in the presentation, is Devon, and each of the white dots on here is a building in Devon. So if we zoom into the kind of main city, which is Exeter, you can see individual buildings there, and people are allocated, people in our synthetic population are allocated to buildings based on the MSOA they are in. So this is the user interface that Improbable built. So our original model was built in R and Python, and as Gavin mentioned, it was fairly slow. So it took about a second, just over a second, to run like a simulated day, whereas the Improbable model improves on that about 10,000-fold. And it also has some other features. For example, we can expose some of the parameters that are in the model. So this is just a handful of the parameters that go into the model. So as Gavin mentioned, we expect that symptomatic people will reduce their, they'll change their behavior, so they'll self-isolate, and this controls how much they self-isolate. So at the moment it's set to them reducing their time outside the home by 90%, but we can change that. And also the different disease statuses, we can change the shape of those and make people infectious for longer. Also the different activities, so we can make homes more dangerous or less dangerous, or more likely to catch COVID in them, and also the different mortality probabilities by age. So we know COVID is an infection, is a disease that affects older people more, and therefore has a higher mortality rate. But we can change that in this user interface. So just to highlight, this is the day ticker. So when I start the model, you'll notice how quickly it goes, and also you'll see dots turn red in the map, and I might just make them a bit coarser just to make it a bit more obvious. So I'll start it now. So you can see the outbreak moving through Devon fairly rapidly. So we're on day 104, and that literally took about 5 seconds to run what would have taken us about 2 hours to run in the R and Python model. And another output, a nice output on the side, is that we have the numbers in each stage, so we can see that about 16,000 people recovered from that outbreak. And then you can roll it back to 0 and step through individual days and see the outbreak progress on a daily basis, which is pretty incredible. And then, yes, I forgot to mention that this is written in OpenCL, and the advantage of that is that you can also run it on GPUs in a fairly straightforward way. So if you were to run it on a GPU on a desktop, I think you could run the whole thing in about a quarter of a second, which is pretty impressive. Yeah, I'll pass back to Gavin to wrap up.
Okay, well, I think we're running out of time if we haven't run out of time. So on the last slide really is just some ideas of future developments. And really what we're doing now is, one, is scale it up nationally. It works in Devon, and despite what we might think in the southwest, there is life outside Devon. And the other is we now have the facility really to kind of impose outbreaks. We can see number of cases, so we can do local outbreaks and then look at the best way of kind of controlling those. And one of the important things we'll be looking at in the near future is the balance between vaccination in areas and control measures. So what is the optimal way of moving between the tiers that were announced very recently, hopefully coming down through the tiers as vaccination is rolled out in different areas. And I think that's a good place to stop and hand back over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Gavin and Fiona. Another fascinating presentation. Great to see a live demonstration working seamlessly. I'm very conscious of time, so in a moment I'm going to hand over to David Simmonds, who's kindly agreed to be our discussant today, and ask him just to give a very brief response to the presentations that we've seen. And then after this session, we have a more informal additional session, which will allow everyone to ask questions and join in the discussion in a slightly more formal setting. So if I can hand over to David and just ask him to give a brief introduction to himself, and then quite a brief response to the presentations to try and instigate some discussion. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Steve. David Simmonds, David Simmonds Consultancy at Heriot-Watt University, various former student or former colleague of a number of different people involved or attending this afternoon. Good to see people again. I'm, as you can imagine, trying to, first of all, to absorb a lot of information and then to comment on it, rather relieved than otherwise that I only have a couple of minutes. Look, if we are aiming to finish at 5 o'clock, Steve, which I believe is the intention.
So we could extend a little bit, David. Yeah. So because yeah, so well, we have such a large group. So yeah, David, do take your time. So let's say we extend to our time to 5:15 for, and this is recorded for any colleagues who have to leave at 5. Apologies, and you could leave. Do come back and watch.
I have 1 or 2 comments and then some questions, and hopefully we can use some of the time which you've just offered to expand on the answers rather than to duplicate questions. But I'm enormously impressed by what has been done here, and there have been careful acknowledgements along the way that a lot of what we've heard has been drawing upon previous work on other projects that were in hand for other reasons, other motives, but it's still very impressive that so much has been brought together in a relatively short time. I'm not going to try to pick detailed holes in anything. I would be very interested to talk more about the stochastic element of the project, the number of runs that have been done to produce averages, indeed the number of times that, whether the seeding is part of the process and so on. I think there are a couple of areas of omission which I would like to raise, partly to test my own feeling that these are important, but probably omitted because they're difficult. And that is that, if I've understood correctly, the modelling considers the time that people spend at home, and there's recognition of the high proportion of infections that are believed to occur in household settings. What I would have thought was important, but hasn't, as far as I recall, been mentioned, is visiting other households, whether that is purely for social or for care visits, people taking care of older or infirm relatives, which is one of those things which involves both the necessity of visit of contact and contact with what in many cases will be a vulnerable person. And I'm interested in whether there is any particular reason why that was omitted or couldn't be dealt with. The other category which we're hearing a lot about at the moment, certainly here in Scotland, is students and other people who are temporarily living away from home, the contribution that they may make to the spread of disease, which is also related, I suppose, to the more general pattern of holiday type movement. We've been hearing today about the risks associated with today's Thanksgiving holiday in America, and the expectation that there will be an even greater surge in cases in a week or two from now. Though I appreciate those occasional trips are particularly difficult to deal with. So those couple of points. First of all, I was also wondering, and I think Gavin nearly got to this point at the end, but didn't quite answer it, to what extent the tiered system that has been in place in Scotland for a little while has just been reintroduced after a more complete lockdown, is being reintroduced in England, to what extent the tier system may allow more data to be collected, which would allow some aspects of the modelling to be refined. So those, if you like, are my questions about what has been done, and they don't in any way take away from my appreciation of what has been done. And then if I put all my questions together first and let the team attempt to answer them, my other thought is about the potential use of this system of models in future, not just in relation to the topic which has been mentioned about what happens as, hopefully vaccination brings COVID-19 permanently under control, but there is still the question of what happens if the vaccines do not prove to be permanently effective, but also whether these models ought to be supported in the longer term and kept available, so that the common elements about who is in the population, what they do, and where they go, which I think is sort of the top three elements of the diagram that Mark showed at the beginning, and Fiona, I think, towards the end, whether that should be kept permanently available as the basis for SIR type modelling of future diseases as they become apparent, or indeed possibly of other emergencies. But most obviously of dealing with infectious diseases as they emerge. Without wishing to end on too negative a note, COVID-19 has been the most serious outbreak, certainly for Europe, for just over a century. But all the signs are that, unfortunately, it will not be the last. And I'm thinking that maybe having this kind of system available and kept available and tested regularly would be a very valuable precaution for government, one way or another, to take against the next pandemic. So I think that was three areas of questions: the, if you like, the friends and relatives, students or similar, about further calibration, whether further calibration can be done using information from areas in different tiers, and then about the long-term future. So, Steve, those are my thoughts and questions. Pass you the question of how to parcel those out amongst the participants.
Thank you, David. Some great insights and comments and questions there. Perhaps we could go through the speakers in speaker order, starting with Nick and Karyn, and then moving through the rest of the presentations, and then perhaps ending with Mike to give a final kind of set of comments. Nick, Karyn, do you have any response to David?
So, David, thank you for bearing with us. I could feel your heart sink when Ying said, oh, let's give it another 15 minutes, which is very gracious of you, Ying. But yes, I guess maybe I can speak to the question about the tiered system. The way we have set up the model is that we can basically implement any sort of scenario in it, as long as we have some sort of underlying data. So for sure, in terms of looking at the impact of different tier systems, we can do that. So some of the work that we're looking at the moment has been to look at, and this is, you know, hot off the press and in no way ready to be published, is looking at perhaps the impact of whether the obesity levels had been lower on cases, or the impact of the vaccine if it had been introduced, if it had been there at day dot. So yes, any sort of scenario that can be driven by data is possible.
Okay. Thank you, Karyn. Is Nick still with us? Is there anything further you'd like to add?
I am, Steve. Forgive me if I missed anything specific, but I don't think I've got anything to add to what Karyn said. Tell me if I should be saying something else. In
that case, we'll move on to Richard. I don't think Adam is with us anymore, but Richard, do you have any comments? I was thinking particularly on student movement.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but I think we did talk about this quite a bit, because we've got all the data on this. I mean, we can certainly move students around. Yeah, the sticking point is probably how you associate risk with each of the students. I mean, you know, the section that I've done with Adam is really just on trip probabilities. I devolve all things about risk to the other groups. I'm not an epidemiology expert. But yeah, in terms of, I did wonder about this. Do we have a complete breakdown of where students come from? Because this would all be potentially disclosive data. But we've certainly got numbers from each university, sort of roughly where people are coming from, where their intakes are coming from.
I believe there's also student flow data, similar to the commuting flow data from the census.
Yeah,
so,
but I think it would have to be synthetic. You know, I think each university probably hands out certain numbers of what do you call it, applications to students, so that they'll know a sort of rough breakdown that could be used, you know, for a synthetic population of students without using anything that's potentially disclosive. So I think that's all possible. But then again, it only happens once a year.
Yeah.
3 times a year, maybe 3 times a year.
6 times a year in effect, so plus a few. Okay.
Jamil and Shanshan and Ying, do you have any further comments?
I have no particular comments, but maybe Ying has something, Ying or Shanshan have something to add.
Well, I suppose that Mike is going to comment on the wider applications and so on. And also, I just noticed Mark is actually in the audience. Yeah, maybe you could bring Mark actually up onto the panel so that Mark could also discuss these issues. So for me, certainly, there's been amazing amount of interdisciplinary efforts in connecting the different models, and I would think that this actually could be used for a number of things. Perhaps the caveat at the moment is that all the efforts has been focused on the more short-term pandemic mitigation issues. And well, on this point, perhaps I could hand over to Mark, actually, who has just come up to the panel.
I think I might quite like the prerogative going last, if that's okay, and let Mike have it.
Well, because you probably now cannot escape.
Oh, Gavin, sorry, Gavin wants to speak as well, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I just maybe to answer one of Richard's specific questions about, well, 2 actually. One is the student movement. And this is something similar to one of the big asks from our local NHS, was actually to try to look at the effect of visitors to the southwest over the summer. And actually that comes down to what happens when 2 populations collide. Well, collide's a bit dramatic maybe. One with a very low infection rate, which the southwest does at the time, and then the rest of the country moving in. And I think that's something, the model, if we can get the data, as Richard said, on kind of student flows, then that's the kind of thing that we could assess the likely effects of sending 1 million people around the country in difficult circumstances. But I think the other really important point you brought up, Richard, was actually the kind of long-term use of this. There is an assumption that when we're all vaccinated, it'll all be fine. If you listen to Donald Trump, it'll all be fine within about 3 weeks' time. Other people have a slightly longer time frame in mind. But of course, this could be really valuable in kind of looking at the effects. If there is a limit to the immunity, hopefully that's not the case. But, you know, to actually look at some of those longer term issues, that it would be good to have some information, some feeling and some evidence, rather than wait until they happen and then kind of be back into a sense of panic. But I'll hand over now.
Okay, perhaps we can move on to Mike, if you have any summary comments.
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, I talk generally about ramp and so on. I mean, I won't say any more about that, apart from handing over to Mark, who will tell us about what's going to happen next, I think. But one of the things that Richard brought up was, this other question of the different flows, student flows. One of the queries that I've had about what we've done is whether or not we should think about different modes of travel. Clearly the pandemic has led to some really very dramatic changes in terms of how different transport modes are used. And for example, supermarkets, a lot of the big supermarkets, you know, have got people coming in by bus, right? So not insignificant numbers, basically, older people and so on. Obviously, the whole public transport thing is in crisis to some extent. So the question is, should our whole effort be extended to deal with modes? And of course, in our quant model, we do have modal split, 3 modes anyway, and we're thinking about quite seriously about getting a 4th mode, which is perhaps walking, maybe biking to 5th mode. Anyway, that's one query. The other thing I think, which is worth saying, and Mark may say something about this, is that it's not been easy, I think, to integrate the different bits. Inevitably, in coupling models in this way, we've got quite a lot of strong coupling in this model, in this model suite, really, in that sense. And it's all been done online, so to speak. None of us have met each other, but in general, you know, in terms of doing this. So, and it seems to me that that is a limit to what we do, to what we're able to do in some sense, although I think we've done it reasonably well. But it's a question mark about, you know, the model running. I mean, for example, I think there's a lot more that could be done at the small scale end of the spatial interaction models. Quite a lot could be done, I think, in terms of linking what Gavin and Fiona said, and Karyn too, about the epidemiological model. There are a lot of very interesting issues there which do connect up with some of the other spatial interaction things and so on. And certainly Jamil's and Ying's journey to work model is quite elaborate in some senses. So I think there's a lot of potential work we need to do potentially in taking it forward. There's a lot of outlets where we can begin to improve the model, I think, as a suite in that sense. Because after all, we still really only have a pilot, right? In a sense, generalizing it to the UK is important. We still only have a pilot, and to some extent, most of it has not been funded by anybody in particular. It's been motivated by RAMP to some extent, and funded from, you know, however we get paid other than that. But we don't yet have the big grant to do this. So over to you, Mark, at this point.
Okay, thanks all. I wasn't trying to time myself out, quite the reverse. So beg your indulgence for another couple of minutes. I did actually want to pick up on a couple of the questions that David raised that I don't think have necessarily been addressed yet. I mean, just reflecting back on the student thing for a minute. I mean, one of the big issues in Leeds locally, clearly a major student town, and the big question is about the level of interaction between students and the rest of the population, I think. Yeah, and then that, you know, I'd link that back to the question you're quite rightly raising, David, about, you know, kind of household interactions and visits and so forth. I mean, I think a couple of things that strike me about that. I mean, one is that, you know, I think certainly at the early, you know, the formative stages when we're thinking about the modelling, you know, wasn't really, probably none of us were envisaging quite the way this thing was going to pan out. And certainly I don't think I would have envisaged, you know, that people in people in Leeds were going to be subject to you know, all kinds of restrictions in tier 3 that, you know, people in London perhaps aren't going to be in a week or two's time, and you know, those kind of questions. So there's an extent to which it's about the way things have developed. I think there's a big data issue in all of that, and I know that people at Public Health England, for example, are making some use of European social survey type data to think about, you know, mixing and interaction between household. Actually, you mentioned care, and the interaction between different demographic groups is quite an important and interesting issue, especially as far as the vaccine is concerned, actually. But perhaps that's something we need to come back to in the informal discussion if that carries on. But having said all that, I mean, I do agree with you. You know, I think it's an important area. I mean, I think it is something that the microsimulation is well placed to kind of absorb, you know, maybe with a bit of, you know, actual agent type modeling, if you like, but certainly with better data about those patterns, which of course also raises some ethical and privacy type questions. So that's a really interesting area. I mean, in terms of the question that you raised at the end there, which then perhaps connects into issues about the future,
of this. Yeah, again, I completely agree. I mean, I tried to make a pointer, I think, in my recording to the fact that I think this kind of infrastructure, if I can put it in those terms, yeah, has long-term benefit in terms of both healthcare and all the other stuff. Just as an aside, I think you were hinting this, but certainly I'd agree. I think Mike and the others would, that, you know, vaccine is not going to be a magic bullet that everybody's happy by next spring. You know, there are going to be all kinds of issues in terms of the way that rolls out, efficacy, compliance, you know, all sorts of things, and then even in all that. Sorry?
Potential evolution of the virus itself as well as
yeah, and yeah, I mean, my wife's a doctor actually, and she's always on about it becoming endemic, you know, and you get it, you know, becomes a flu-like thing where it comes back every year in different forms, and you know, so well, I guess we don't completely know, but anyway, it's not going anywhere in a hurry, I don't think. But yeah, so I do think that there's capacity, a requirement really for some kind of permanent infrastructure of this type. We are in some interesting discussions with various people in government, Cabinet Office, Number 10, JBC, all that kind of thing about that. You know, one of the issues is that your main streams of research funding, UKRIs and so forth, actually, in my opinion, not very good at being strategic. In fact, they're very good at not being strategic. And well, yeah, no, let's not go there. But you know, I think that there is an opportunity there. I think there is something valuable that could be done. I also think, yeah, having something like a National Institute for Data Science. Again, lots of issues at the moment about long-term funding models and strategy for the Turing, but having some kind of major institute there where we can identify, you know, things that we think are important and maybe establish a long-term program in. I mean, we talk about digital twins for cities, or maybe people are starting to talk about synthetic environments for modeling and simulation and that kind of thing. Yeah, certainly that's the direction I would like to see us going over the next year or two, and the direction I think we should be going. But you may say he would say that, wouldn't he? Perhaps I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ying. Back to you. Or Steve or David, I'm not sure. Whichever.
Yeah. David, any would you like to come back? And any thoughts?
No, just to repeat that I'm very impressed with what has been done and hope that further use can be made of it for whatever we face in future. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, David. Actually, to actually distill succinctly, actually on the fly, the comments, which are really useful. And thank you, Steve, as well for chairing the whole discussion through. Really enjoyed it. Well, there's a lot more to talk about, but we won't have time on this session anymore. If I could just add one point, which is that the one valuable point of this collaboration, which I enjoyed, was actually to put the UK back together again in terms of data, as Richard has said in there. So I think this is a point that as we move forward, we might be doing. And David, yourself actually has been doing quite a lot of work on land use and transport modeling and also microsimulation, and perhaps we should connect more with you going forward. And so I'm afraid that we're now timed out, because I really want to start the informal session for people and colleagues actually to discuss some other questions in an informal way in the second Zoom meeting, which you have got in your email, and also you have copied into the chat box as well. All right?
Yeah, already in the chat box.
Excellent, well done. So while people, well, I'll allow colleagues actually to copy that. I would just say that for those who watch in the United States and North America who celebrate Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving today. And then, well, with that, maybe you could press the red button so we end this session, and then we will move on to the informal session. And the colleagues are welcome to have a comfort break, and then perhaps if you have time, do join us there actually to discuss further if you have time. Thank you all, and it was a great session. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.